Hi folks, so a few people actually over the last few months have asked me to talk about the difference between bucklers and shields. The very simple difference is that a buckler is small, usually 12 inches or 9 inches in diameter. If it's much more than 12 inches then you'd start to call it a targe probably. And bucklers usually have a bar grip, okay, like that. And you hold the bar and your fist goes into that dome at the front there. A shield, on the other hand, is held by straps and is bigger. Okay. Now I did mention a targe there. A targe is a weapon that kind of sits almost between the buckler and the shield, in that it's relatively small. It's usually only, the targe is traditionally the length of your forearm, just enough to cover the forearm pretty much, maybe a little bit extra either side. But it is held onto your arm with straps, or at least one strap around your forearm and one strap in your hand, that kind of thing. And targes were popular in various cultures at various times, actually small shields we'll call them, but most famously used by the Highlanders of Scotland from the, let's say, the 16th century through to the mid-18th century, mostly. Earlier period Scottish shields tend to be a bit bigger and a bit more like other European shields. And I should also mention that there are the buckler itself evolves from earlier centre-held, boss-held as we would call them, boss-held shields, okay, as seen in the Viking, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon Longobard period, the migration era as it's usually known in history. Okay, and essentially with those shields, as I'm sure you all know, and Skallagrim did a video about Viking boss-held shields recently, a large wooden shield, and at the centre you have something that looks like a small version of this, and at the back you've got the same thing. You've got a grip, you know, a bar at the back there to hold. In the case of the Viking Anglo-Saxon period, that's usually made of wood rather than steel. However, I should mention that many medieval bucklers, although most modern recreations are completely steel, many original medieval bucklers, actually this flat bit, even though it's small, was often made of wood, the grip was made of wood, and just the centre boss was made of metal, because of course steel and iron were valuable commodities at the time, so if you weren't very well off, then you would buy the cheapest buckler you could, and that would involve less metal and more wood, because wood was cheap. In terms of the strengths and weaknesses of bucklers versus shields, well, it's a big question to ask, because obviously shields come in a huge variety of types. You've got boss-held shields like the Viking shields that I've mentioned. Then you've got shields which are strapped onto your arm but are still quite small, like targes. And then a bit bigger than that, you've got what are known as heater shields, the traditional knight-shaped shield. Okay, heater because it's the shape of an iron that that you would iron your clothes with. It's not a medieval term at all. It's a term that we give them. Then you've got, at the other end of the spectrum, you've got massive shields like pavises. A pavis looks like a Roman shield. It's long and it's curved, and it can be held in various different ways. Or indeed, there were particularly heavy versions that were used for siege warfare that were just stood on the ground, and they were used for crossbowmen to reload their crossbows, hiding behind them to protect themselves, to protect them from enemy archers while they were reloading. But there were also smaller, lighter pavises which were carried, particularly on foot, not usually used on horseback, but carried on foot. Sometimes I know in role-playing games and computer games they're sometimes known as tower shields. Again, the term tower shield is a completely modern thing. I think it probably dates from whenever first edition AD&D is from. But a tower shield essentially is a pavis. Traditionally it's actually called a pavis. And then you've got Norman shields, which are like a teardrop shape, very long, and they're about the same length as a pavis, but they're lighter because of course they're pointed at one end instead of still being broad at the bottom. And you've still got, even in the late medieval period, you've still got large round shields, but they tend to become domed instead of flat like a Viking shield. They're actually like a great big, almost semi-sphere, and again you hold those with straps. So there's a huge variety of shields, so it's very difficult to compare all shields with bucklers, because bucklers, there's less variety. A buckler is a small object that you hold in your fist. Yes, you can hold it, sometimes you have two straps, sometimes you have one bar, but it actually functionally doesn't really change the use of the buckler very much. The buckler is essentially an object that you hold a lot of the time at arm's length, or to protect your sword hand. So if I grab a medieval style sword here, if I was cutting at you, so if we go into this sort of guard position, or this sort of guard position, or that sort of guard position, when I cut at you, instead of cutting out here and extending my arm beyond the buckler, that arm is now very, very vulnerable. So I've often talked in many of my videos about how one of the problems with medieval swords, in the grand scheme of things, obviously medieval people didn't see it as a problem because to them it was just normal. That's what a sword looks like, and this is the weakness of it. The weakness is that your hand is vulnerable. Yes, the crossguard gives some degree of protection in the plane of the edge, I'll remind you, not in the plane of the flat. So whether you're defending or attacking, you do have that bar that by geometry and angulation you'll see. If you just look, can you see that bar covers all the way down to my little finger pretty much from that angle? So it does protect my fingers to some degree. However, the hand and forearm is still quite vulnerable. So in buckler, rather than cutting so my sword arm's extended beyond the buckler, what we tend to do is, if I was cutting out, boom, the hands tend to finish level, and the effect that this has is that my sword arm, if I was cutting at you here, my sword arm, you'll see, and hand is hidden behind the buckler. So some people have asked, you know, oh, why weren't complex handguards like basket hilts and saber hilts developed earlier? Again, that's for another video, it's a really big topic, but one of the things to remember is that at least in civilian sword and buckler fighting, and remember that these were pretty much the most popular combo for Northern European medieval civilians, in other words, people who were fighting not in armour, they were fighting in the street or brawling, or you know, they were criminals or whatever, just fighting in civilian life. This was a very, very popular combo, and when they used the shield and, sorry, the buckler and the sword together, their hand is very well protected by the buckler. Even if I hold the buckler extended to begin with and start with my weapon back, as you often see in, if I put the sword up here, this is called Guardia di Alta in the Bolognese school of fencing. Okay, this particular position, so it's a bit similar to Vardi's Posta di Falcone, except it's done one-handed. And even though the weapons might start apart, when I do an action, whether to attack or indeed to parry, the two hands tend to come together, and the buckler and the sword often join at that moment of impact, at that moment of danger, when the other person's weapon is a threat to my hand and arm. Okay? They do equally then often come apart when I do my riposte or my follow-up counter-attack. But they're coming together and breaking apart all the time, and what the result of that is that my sword arm is very often protected by the buckler. Even when I'm in a static position, if a person wants to attack my sword arm, they have to get past my buckler. And you'll notice the buckler held extended provides a lot of protection. Not only does it to you on the camera there look a lot bigger because it's now closer to you and further to me, you've got to get around this to hit me. And honestly, it's no big effort to just move that buckler a little bit and try not to blind yourself with it, so you try to look under it or over it or either side of it all the time, to block quite a big area with a very small movement, because it's about angulation. The further the buckler is from me, the bigger the cone of defence that's caused by it. Okay? So bucklers work in quite a different way to shields. Shields are strapped on your arm and generally held closer to the body. Okay? Bucklers are obviously held in your fist and held out away from your body. So they really function in quite different ways. Although a buckler is superficially a small shield, it doesn't have an awful lot in common with some of the large shields that are strapped onto your arm. It has more in common, a lot more in common, with Anglo-Saxon Viking period shields, which are boss held and are sometimes held out at length. Not all the time, because they're quite heavy, and it would just kill your shoulder to try and hold a full-size Viking period shield at arm's length all the time, and also you pretty much blind yourself, you wouldn't be able to see around it. Okay, so they tend to be held probably closer in here, probably more like with the elbow in. And with small angulation with those shields, you can cover either side of your body, or indeed your head as you attack under it, and you can do different. You can attack either side of the big shield quite easily, just as you can with the buckler when it's boss held. So, to cut a long story short, it's not easy to compare a buckler with all shields because there's a huge variety in different types of shields. A pavis is used very differently to an Anglo-Saxon boss-held shield. Equally, a knightly heater shield, which is used in full armour, might be used very differently to how a non-armoured or very lightly armoured Renaissance infantryman might use a rotella, which is the big round shield. They're similar sizes, but if you're wearing full plate armour and you're carrying a heater shield, it might be more about closing one line and not worrying too much about hits to your limbs because you're wearing armour. Whereas someone using a rotella, for example, may well extend the rotella out more because they're more concerned about protecting their extremities. We actually don't know a huge amount about how some types of shields were used because they're not mentioned. The techniques for sword and shield are not really detailed in treatises. We know nothing for certain about any fighting styles from before, in Europe at least, from before 1300 AD. So in 1300 or thereabouts, a few years either side of that date, we have the first fencing treatise is I-33 using the sword and buckler. We have nothing dating to before that, so we don't know anything factual about Viking sword and shield or Frankish sword and shield or Anglo-Saxon sword and shield. We can only interpret some of it from narrative accounts and chronicles and such like, and sagas. Okay? And a lot of that is guesswork, and we could be wildly wrong. All we can really do is look at the sword and buckler and the later period sources and apply it to the earlier stuff. Even in terms of the knightly shield of like the 14th century used with a sword, we don't really know very much, because by the time the treatises started to be written for the so-called knightly martial arts, you're talking about 1389 onwards. Well, shields, at least in Western Europe, had really gone out of use by the so-called knights, in other words people wearing full armour, by about 1360, 1370. So by about 10 or 20 years, the treatises we study are too late to tell us anything useful about sword and shield use, really. And really, the only two strong large shield and sword, or large shield and weapon sources we have from the treatises, in other words from direct technical explanations of techniques, are the German tradition of Dueling Shield, okay, which is a very large type of shield that's a bit like a pavis, but probably a lot lighter than a pavis and held in a different way than a pavis. I won't go into Dueling Shield now, I'll deal with that in a different video. But the tradition, the German trial by combat tradition of using a large shield in the left hand and a weapon. In one part of Germany it was a sword, in the other part of Germany it was a club. So we've got technical sources, Talhofer, Paulus Kahl and so on, Das Ollerstern, Codex Wallerstein and such like, that deal with that tradition of trial by combat with a large shield and weapon. And then from Italy we have some Bolognese, in other words from Bologna in Italy, sources talking about the use of the sword, in their case the side sword, spada de lato, as we would call it now, but it's basically a one-handed medieval sword but with a finger ring or pair of finger rings, used in conjunction with a rotella, and a rotella is a large round domed shield that I referred to before that's strapped on the arm. And those are the only real technical sources we have describing the use of large shields with weapons, and they are very different to each other. Of course there are some parallels in the sense that there are parallels in all martial arts, but they are very different from each other. The Bolognese way of using a rotella and a sword is very different to the Talhofer way of using a dueling shield and a sword. Okay, quite different things. They're quite different shields. And it's a different period. We're talking about not quite 100 years, but about 70 years difference between them. So it's really difficult saying an awful lot about shield use with certainty. We can make interpretations, but we don't have a lot of evidence to make hard and fast technical descriptions of techniques from this period using a weapon and a shield. Okay, so to round things off, the basic reason for a buckler as opposed to a shield is ease of carriage. Okay, that is, a buckler can be worn hanging off the sword hilt. Okay, so if you can carry a sword, you can carry a buckler. It's much like the rapier and dagger later in the 16th, 17th centuries. These are pretty easy to carry around. They're not the best weapons in the world, however I would contend sword and buckler is pretty awesome in the sphere of sword comparisons. It matches very well against longsword, it does okay against rapier and dagger, it does well against backswords and sabres and such like. So it's a pretty good combo. It's very good in defence, in my opinion. It's better, if I was comparing it to longsword, which of course is from the same period, my personal opinion is that sword and buckler is much better in defence than longsword. Longsword's maybe a little bit better in offence, okay? But personally, even though I have vastly more experience with longsword than I do with sword and buckler, if I had to walk around 15th century streets in Italy or any other country, and I could choose my weapons, I would carry a sword and buckler as being my chosen sidearms. I wouldn't personally carry a longsword in a civilian environment, if I was legally allowed to, that is. Because not everybody could carry a longsword anyway. Okay, so sword and buckler is pretty awesome and it's easy to carry. You can't in most civilian situations carry a large shield around. First of all, it's not practical. Most shields are more or less heavy, and if you had to carry them around all day, it's just ridiculous. You can literally wear these all day and not, once you're used to wearing a sword, you don't really notice these, okay? Carrying a shield around all day is insane. It would just be crazy, it would get in the way, and frankly, in a medieval setting, in a medieval civilian setting, you'd look like an idiot, okay? People who weren't either town guards or on some kind of military duties just didn't walk around carrying full-size shields by the late medieval period. It just didn't happen. It wasn't normal. So that's why when you look at Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, for example, that most of the men going on pilgrimage to Canterbury carry sword and buckler because they're easy to carry. You don't even notice they're there. You probably won't need them anyway. And they do pretty well. And you know what? Sword and shield versus sword and buckler, I'd say maybe the sword and shield, if it's an average size shield, maybe it has a slight advantage over the sword and buckler, but you just can't carry a shield around all day in your civilian life while you go about your business. It's ridiculous. Okay, so lots of things to think about there, and I'm sure this video will raise more questions which will lead to more videos hopefully. Okay, cheers.